I want to discuss an incredible speech that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just gave today. And if you haven't followed this closely, I will just briefly recap what happened. And then I'm going to bring on Dr. Sarah Myhre, who is just an incredible communicator and someone who does a great job putting intersectional feminism at the forefront of how we think about public communication, public narratives, and climate policy. And she has a lot of great insights here. But just to recap what happened, the Hill newspaper, one of the newspapers on Capitol Hill, they recounted this incident one of the reporters overheard, and it was Representative Ted Yoho. He's a Republican from Florida, confront Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, and he confronted her with a piece of misinformation. It was some stuff going around, Fox News and the right-wing Twitter sphere or whatever, falsely accusing her of excusing violent crime in a discussion that she was having about why some people who are in poverty engage in things like petty theft, to get food, to get necessary supplies, to get medicine for their family to survive. And he told her that, quote, "You are out of your freaking mind," unquote. Ocasio-Cortez pointed out that he was being rather rude. On the way out, Representative Yoho referred to her as an effing B word. And you can fill in the blanks there. I don't I don't want to say those words out loud as raised not to say that word. But this is really remarkable, right? Members of Congress usually don't talk to each other like this, certainly not in public. And what Representative Yoho did here was just incredibly misogynistic. It was a real personal attack on Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and he made this remark to Representative Roger Williams, who's a Republican from Texas, after his confrontation that he initiated with Representative Ocasio-Cortez ended. There's been some back and forth on this. Representative Yoho yesterday gave a very non-apology speech, which we'll play and discuss. And then this morning, AOC came in and just gave an absolute incredible speech. It's about 10 minutes long. I've included the thing in full in this podcast, but I really wanted to identify what's going on with the power relationships that each of these speakers is talking about, how they constructed their speeches, and how much AOC packed into this really important 10-minute speech. And to have this discussion, I brought on a scientist, a scholar, an advocate for human rights, Dr. Sarah Myhre. She is a paleoceanographer by training, and that means she studies changes to the ocean's past, which can help us understand climate change today. If you don't know it, the ocean is made of water, and water is very good at trapping heat. So the ocean is somewhat underappreciated as an area we need to pay attention to on climate change. There's a lot of important stuff at the ocean. If you've heard of the Green New Deal, there's a Blue New Deal framework out there too. Please pay attention to your ocean if you want to solve climate change. She's someone that I've collaborated with through an organization called 500 Women Scientists, and also an organization she founded called the Rowan Institute. And that helps build leadership and communication skills through an intersectional justice-focused lens in climate policy. And it's critically important for successful climate policy. And it's also really important for thinking about how we operate as public communicators. So with that, I'm going to bring on Sarah. We're going to analyze these speeches, and I'll come back at the end for a few wrap-up thoughts. Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Aaron.
Great to have you here. I'm really excited that we got to connect. You and I were both tweeting about this AOC speech, and I thought to myself, oh, this is absolutely the one person I want to talk to right now about this speech and how good it was.
So good. It was so good.
Okay, so before we get into it, we want to talk about Representative Yoho's non-apology. We want to get into AOC's speech and break down the incredible job that she did with this. But first, I wanted to set this framework. And this is a book that I'm pretty sure you introduced me to. It was Kate Mann's book. It's called Down Girl, and it's about the logic of misogyny. And she has these great working definitions of patriarchy and misogyny. And I wanted to talk about those with you for a minute. So how does Kate Mann define patriarchy and misogyny?
Well, I mean, Kate Mann is an absolute savant and genius in this space. She's a philosopher at Cornell, and she describes patriarchy as patriarchy is often misconceived as the hatred of women hating men, and it's not. Patriarchy is a comprehensive system of punishment and violence, and it acts out on women that are outside of a lane of behavior that is accepted and normalized within patriarchy. So it's a punitive system.
Yeah, and she defines misogyny as a social code that is enforced on people who challenge patriarchy, and it's largely enforced on women. It can also be enforced on men who criticize patriarchy. But what does she mean by a social code in that context?
Well, I think my understanding is that this social code is this implied assumption that there is a lane that you are going to be rewarded in for functioning and acting like a good woman. And of course, we're talking, when we talk about women and men, we're breaking into a binary that truly isn't real. And we're also not talking about other intersections of identity and discrimination. And so this is a sort of a thought puzzle that needs to then be plugged back into the true contextualization of the complexity that exists across a gendered and racial hierarchy, just for context, But this social code itself is, it looks like violence. It looks like threats. It looks like ostracizing. It is all of the social, economic, behavioral consequences that are experienced by women that step outside of the lane of what that good woman box is normatively supposed to be. And so it's a series of penalties that happen to your physical body, to your career, to your voice in public, to your family. It's a comprehensive system of punishment.
Well, and you've written and spoken a lot about the ways in which science is a patriarchal system, and the ways in which science and the scientific institutions and people in science punish people who speak out against it. And obviously we see that in politics too. So what happens to women like AOC who attain these positions of power and prominence, in politics, in these patriarchal structures? What are the incentives for the people who want to uphold patriarchy when it gets challenged? What are the incentives for the people who want to use misogyny to then go after those powerful women?
I mean, the thing about it is that it's very effective. It is incredibly effective to use these tropes to reframe the behavior of women in ways that demonstrate that they are, characterizing them as hysterical, irrelevant, reactionary, unqualified, emotional, all of these tropes that are weaponized to deconstruct any, vestige of power that women might have in public. And the thing about science is that it's all about public power. It's not necessarily about, being the smartest person in the room. It's about the person who can perform, white respectability politics in the most convincing manner that gets the power accreditation and gets bought in. So misogyny fits really well inside of that milieu. It is a very effective tool to degrade, remove, erase, silence women who are trying to own their own public power in political settings, in scientific settings, inside of institutions.
Yeah, and, I'm often struck by how irrational people get when patriarchy is challenged and they're upholding it, and they can't listen to. Yeah, they can't listen to what you're saying, and they go into attack mode. And I've seen it when people speak up in scientific contexts. I've seen it even myself as a communicator when I said, hey, we should listen to this feminist criticism of science. It's interesting. And having other men say, no, this is SJW nonsense, and we need to solve feminism later. We have to solve climate change now. Why are you putting this SJW stuff in my face? And it's like, well, actually, what would be cool is if we all solved climate change together and we respected what people had to say. But I've noticed it certainly in politics with AOC. There's all these really wild narratives about her that people use to avoid just dealing with the criticism, right? She's not mature enough yet to have an opinion about whatever. And it's like, she has a degree in economics, and I think about this with her history too. Like,
Totally.
she ran for office and won. Like, what did you do? Like, she's a duly elected member of Congress. She earned the right to say and do whatever the heck she wants and have an opinion that we should listen to. And it's really interesting on the politics to look at how, like Bernie will get dismissed as like, oh, well, that's just wacky socialist Bernie from Vermont. But then the stuff about AOC, even though it's very similar policy positions, it's sexist, it's misogynistic, it's racist, it's classist. All this other stuff comes in because people see this disconnect between what they think a leader should look like, an old white guy senator speaking in stentorian tones, and then they see this very powerful young Latina woman who unseated a very powerful incumbent. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that disconnect and how that triggers people to attack folks who are challenging patriarchy.
you know, there's so many lines here. One thing I think that it's important is AOC is a really beautiful woman too. She has these kind of cultural, these associated characteristics, the red lip. She is youthful in the styling of her dress in this way where she's really beautiful. She's really attractive. And so I think it sets off all these like alarm bells for men in power. Wait a second, women's sexuality is a performance for my consumption. And what AOC is doing through her presentation is saying, my sexuality, my body, my beauty, this is all mine. It's part of my power in the world. It's a reclamation of the power of being a woman in the world. Like the red lip itself, that is a very clear signal around power that she is using. And, I have done similar things around reclamation and sex and power of like moving through the world in a way that I feel beautiful, that I feel, sort of transformed in this lens, that I am subverting the male gaze into currency that is actually power that I use for my own work in the world. So there's that level that's occurring. And I think that shit is like kryptonite for these guys, where they see a young woman that they think is supposed to be a sexual object for them. It's like she's supposed to be a two-dimensional object that they consume, and she's not doing the thing that they want. And so I think that fuels all of this misogynistic rage, this like deep-seated rage that she should remain in this domain of sexualized object, like that's where she belongs. And that's where she would be rewarded by the culture if she stayed in that lane, like be sexy and be silent. We like it when you're over there. So I think that that's definitely occurring in these dynamics. But I think the other piece, as you premise the question, is like how this system itself is a comprehensive system that punishes men and women and people who are non-binary, because what ultimately these systems of power are about is retaining power for a select few of men in the patriarchy. And people oppose patriarchal control and narrative control, people that are men, people that are non-binary, people that are women. And so there is a retention of power that is operating here. And the lashing out is happening because your centrality in the culture is being fundamentally questioned. Maybe we shouldn't live in a culture that is principally dictated by white men telling people what to do and what is right or what is wrong. That ultimate premise, that SJW like framing on the world of like, maybe we should think about how other people experience the world and value their humanity and show up in solidarity for struggles that are not directly, impacting our own bodies or our families. That lens is to these men, it is a threat to their very existence and the stories they tell about them. And when your existence is threatened, you lash out in really incoherent and violent and destructive manners. And so that's what we see over and over again, is that these frames and questions that are meant to reordinate the world and the center of power and the stories we tell, those stories are responded to by men in just phenomenally violent ways in public, and then also behind closed doors too.
Yeah, and I want to underscore this before we get into the speeches themselves, but making leadership representative of the communities that leaders are supposed to serve, representative of science, the country, whatever, we have to address these issues head on, right? So when you look at how unrepresentative Congress is, when you look at how unrepresentative scientific leadership is compared to the people we want to recruit into Congress, the people we want to recruit into science, this is all fundamentally about power, right? So I think you nailed the analysis there, and I want to underscore that one of the reasons that we're approaching it this way is that to fully analyze this conflict is to understand these power relationships, and understanding them is absolutely how we have to ground effective political communication and effective advocacy in these spaces.
100%, completely agree.
Okay, so I'm going to play Representative Ted Yoho's speech. This is, let's call it the non-apology speech. This was him taking to the House floor to respond to this coverage in the Hill that I discussed previously at the opening of the episode. And this is a very short non-apology. It's very short and not very sweet. So we're going to play that, listen to it in full, and then Sarah and I are going to come back in and break it down.
Thank you, Chairman Conway. Mr. Speaker, I stand before you this morning to address the strife I injected into the already contentious Congress. I have worked with many members in this chamber over the past 4 terms, members on both sides of the aisle, and each of you know that I'm a man of my word. So let me take a moment to address this body. I rise to apologize for the abrupt manner of the conversation I had with my colleague from New York. It is true that we disagree on policies and visions for America, but that does not mean we should be disrespectful. Having been married for 45 years with 2 daughters, I'm very cognizant of my language. The offensive name-calling words attributed to me by the press were never spoken to my colleagues, and if they were construed that way, I apologize for their misunderstanding. As my colleagues know, I'm passionate about those affected by poverty. My wife Carolyn and I started out together at the age of 19 with nothing. We did odd jobs, and we were on food stamps. I know the face of poverty, and for a time it was mine. That is why I know people in this country can still, with all its faults, rise up and succeed and not be encouraged to break the law. I will commit to each of you that I will conduct myself from a place of passion and understanding, that policy and political disagreement be vigorously debated with the knowledge that we approach the problems facing our nation with the betterment of the country in mind and the people we serve. I cannot apologize for my passion or for loving my God, my family, and my country. I yield back.
Okay, so that was Representative Yoho. Sarah, was that an apology?
No. No. Not at all. It was an exonerative performance for himself to recenter the narrative upon his own struggle and his ideation of what actually. So he's lying about what happened, and in that process is providing an exonerative narrative for him to move on as really the hero of the story.
Yeah, so I'm going to put on my speechwriter hat here. Words attributed to me. That is some passive voice BS. Okay, why were the words attributed to you? Because you said them.
You said the words.
Because you called. Because you did the thing, man. He apologizes for the strife I injected.
Yeah.
And this was interesting to me because this.
Sorry, these ladies were upset.
Yeah, and it's kind of this meta point of it's like the same way people talk about partisanship or whatever. It's all about tone, and it's at such this high level. It's not about strife. It's he hurt somebody else. He did a very hurtful, bad thing.
Well, the culture itself has been trying to reconcile with what a real apology looks like. What is an apology? Ever since the center of this conversation has really developed since the Me Too movement. and particularly focused on, prominent comedians that were outed as being like horrible abusers that tanked, many, many women's careers. And, like Louis C.K., right? And so that I think that this thematic question about like what is an apology, like the culture has not reconciled with what a real apology is. We just don't know. We can't recognize it writ large. I mean, but together, like it's very easy to put down, like in conversation, what does a real apology look like? And it doesn't look like I'm sorry if, I'm sorry but.
Right?
That's not how you apologize. Go ahead.
I mean, well, this is like a trope now when people issue public apologies, is like people will screen cap the part of the apology where the but comes in, and it's like, it's not an apology. There's no but. So yeah, can you unpack to the instinct here to like, okay, so the person who has done the misogynistic thing, the person who's chosen to enforce patriarchy in a hurtful way, their response here is to just put themselves right back at the center of the narrative. So why do people do that, in your opinion? Because this is such a common way to respond.
I think in contexts like this, they likely don't know that they are even positioning themselves right back into the moral center as the moral hero, the narrator of the event, the person who has been unfortunately maligned by this event. They are narrating their centrality because they don't have a robust enough lens on their own behavior. They can't be self-reflexive. The self-reflexivity has been trained out of them by the system of patriarchy. And so this blindness that they're operating in now, this is not an exonerative narrative for these guys. Like, they're fully responsible for their behavior. And yet they don't have the skills to understand what they are doing. And yet what they are doing is so effective because it recenters the narrative. It affords them the centrality to tell the story and, provide an exonerative opportunity for themselves to replay and reframe what, quote, actually happened. So this is a rhetorical tool that's being used and weaponized against people who have been assaulted, demeaned, and devalued in public. And it's super effective because many, many times people are not even aware that this kind of dance rhetorically is happening. So it's very upsetting, though, because for me, when I hear that, what I hear underneath it is the subtext is, she's not a real person. She doesn't deserve my attention. She should not be afforded the moral weight and merit to even be addressed fully. And so I'm going to, like a weasel, just negotiate around her so-called grievance. And then I'm going to, reframe the narrative about how basically I'm a hero and I have been forever. So
you're
dismaying.
You're totally right. He barely mentions her.
He barely mentions
it's
her.
I.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he ends up saying, "I cannot apologize for my passion. My passion. Come on." Right. And that's an interesting choice of word, right? That can have a lot of meanings. And what the heck? What a terrible thing to say after you curse out a member of Congress, like in an incredibly misogynistic way.
It's not passionate too. That itself is a lie, right? Because you can be passionate. I can be passionate about like going swimming or, chopping wood. Like, I can be passionate about things that I'm excited about, but I don't actually have to be a violent misogynist to do so. None of that is required to be passionate. And the reframing of men's anger and men's violence as passion, that is a lie. It's a ploy to disguise the true intention of his act, which was to intimidate and silence her in a physically intimidating and violent way. and to play upon the cultural tropes that are already used to diminish her work in the world. So it's an incredibly sinister narrative for him to use in this context, that this is a passionate display rather than a display that's fueled by hatred and violence and supremacy.
Yeah, and he got rightfully roasted for this because it was such a non-apology. But there's one other thing he did here that I want to unpack before we get into AOC's speech.
Mm-hmm.
And he does the, I'm a husband, I'm a father of daughters thing, right? So people, even well-meaning people, go there sometimes, right? Because we love our moms, we love our wives, we love our daughters.
Mm-hmm.
But why is that a trope, and why is that actually a problematic way to get at this?
This is how misogyny works, right? Some women are deserving of the moral attention, support, safety, and accolades that patriarchy affords them because they are in the right lane. Those are the mothers and daughters. But other women, those are the women that are outside the lane of the good woman, the good wife, the good daughter. And those are the women that deserve the violence, the demeaning behavior, the performance of power upon them. And that transaction is a crystallization of what misogyny is that men get to pick and choose which women are afforded that safety and that place of reverence. And so that narrative hook, I mean, he probably used that to remember and recharacterize that, hey, I'm a really nice family man. I'm a great guy. But that is coded language for, I get to pick and choose which women I demean and harass and accost because I'm the one in control.
Absolutely. Okay, so do we feel like we've given Representative Yoho enough time?
He deserves less time than we've given him, I think.
Okay. So clearly, not an apology. We've spent more time on what he didn't say, right? Mm-hmm. Which is also as important as what he says. So now I want to get into AOC's response, and it was something else. It's really rare to see people, look at a 10-minute speech on the floor like this and think, wow, you got to listen to this. This is just incredible. She does a great job with this. If you, the listener, think you have heard this speech because you saw a soundbite on your social media feed, or you were watching the news and they played 15 seconds of it, trust me, you have not heard the speech. A lot of the clips that I saw were about her sharing her personal story, talking about how her father is not around to see what he did to her. But the speech is so much more comprehensive than that. So I'm going to include the speech in the podcast here. If you have listened to the speech in full, feel free to just go ahead and fast forward through it, or better yet, listen to it again because it's just that good. But if you haven't had the chance, take the time, really listen to her words, listen to what she has to say, listen to how she uses her power and her rhetoric, listen to how she uses storytelling, and listen to how she connects her personal experience to this incredible, comprehensive, systemic critique of what is happening. So with that, we're going to transition out. We're going to let AOC take over from the House floor in the Capitol, and then we'll be back with some more analysis.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I seek recognition for a question of personal privilege.
The chair has been made aware of the valid base for the gentlewoman's point of personal privilege. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I would also like to thank many of my colleagues for the opportunity to not only speak today, but for the many members from both sides of the aisle who have reached out to me in support following an incident earlier this week. About 2 days ago, I was walking up the steps of the Capitol when Representative Yoho suddenly turned a corner, and he was accompanied by Representative Roger Williams, and accosted me on the steps right here in front of our nation's Capitol. I was minding my own business, walking up the steps, and Representative Yoho put his finger in my face. He called me disgusting. He called me crazy. He called me out of my mind. And he called me dangerous. And then he took a few more steps, and after I had recognized his comments as rude, he walked away and said, "I'm rude. You're calling me rude." I took a few steps ahead, and I walked inside and cast my vote, because my constituents send me here each and every day to fight for them and to make sure that they are able to keep a roof over their head, that they're able to feed their families, and that they're able to carry their lives with dignity. I walked back out, and there were reporters in the front of the Capitol, and in front of reporters, Representative Yoho called me, and I quote, "a fucking bitch." These are the words that Representative Yoho levied against a congresswoman, the congresswoman that not only represents New York's 14th congressional district, but every congresswoman and every woman in this country, because all of us have had to deal with this in some form, some way, some shape, at some point in our lives. And I want to be clear that Representative Yoho's comments were not deeply hurtful or piercing to me, because I have worked a working class job. I have waited tables in restaurants. I have ridden the subway. I have walked the streets in New York City. And this kind of language is not new. I have encountered words uttered by Mr. Yoho and men uttering the same words as Mr. Yoho while I was being harassed in restaurants. I have tossed men out of bars that have used language like Mr. Yoho's. And I have encountered this type of harassment riding the subway in New York City. This is not new. And that is the problem. Mr. Yoho was not alone. He was walking shoulder to shoulder with Representative Roger Williams. And that's when we start to see that this issue is not about one incident. It is cultural. It is a culture of lack of impunity, of accepting of violence and violent language against women, and an entire structure of power that supports that. Because not only have I been spoken to disrespectfully, particularly by members of the Republican Party and elected officials in the Republican Party, not just here, but the President of the United States last year told me to go home to another country, with the implication that I don't even belong in America. The governor of Florida, Governor DeSantis, before I even was sworn in, called me a whatever that is. Dehumanizing language is not new. And what we are seeing is that incidents like these are happening in a pattern. This is a pattern of an attitude towards women and dehumanization of others. So while I was not deeply hurt or offended by little comments that are made, when I was reflecting on this, I honestly thought that I was just going to pack it up and go home. It's just another day, right? But then yesterday, Representative Yoho decided to come to the floor of the House of Representatives and make excuses for his behavior. And that I could not let go. I could not allow my nieces, I could not allow the little girls that I go home to, I could not allow victims of verbal abuse and worse to see that excuse, and to see our Congress accept it as legitimate and accept it as an apology, and to accept silence as a form of acceptance. I could not allow that to stand, which is why I am rising today to raise this point of personal privilege. And I do not need Representative Yoho to apologize to me. Clearly, he does not want to. Clearly, when given the opportunity, he will not. And I will not stay up late at night waiting for an apology from a man who has no remorse over calling women and using abusive language towards women. But what I do have issue with is using women, our wives and daughters, as shields and excuses for poor behavior. Mr. Yoho mentioned that he has a wife and 2 daughters. I am 2 years younger than Mr. Yoho's youngest daughter. I am someone's daughter too. My father, thankfully, is not alive to see how Mr. Yoho treated his daughter. My mother got to see Mr. Yoho's disrespect on the floor of this house towards me on television. And I am here because I have to show my parents that I am their daughter and that they did not raise me to accept abuse from men. Now, what I am here to say is that this harm that Mr. Yoho tried to levy against me was not just an incident directed at me. But when you do that to any woman, what Mr. Yoho did was give permission to other men to do that to his daughters. In using that language in front of the press, he gave permission to use that language against his wife, his daughters, women in his community. And I am here to stand up to say that is not acceptable. I do not care what your views are. It does not matter how much I disagree or how much it incenses me or how much I feel that people are dehumanizing others. I will not do that myself. I will not allow people to change and create hatred in our hearts. And so what I believe is that having a daughter does not make a man decent. Having a wife does not make a decent man. Treating people with dignity and respect makes a decent man. And when a decent man messes up, as we all are bound to do, he tries his best and does apologize. Not to save face, not to win a vote. He apologizes genuinely to repair and acknowledge the harm done so that we can all move on. Lastly, what I want to express to Mr. Yoho is gratitude. I want to thank him for showing the world that you can be a powerful man and accost women. You can have daughters and accost women without remorse. You can be married and accost women. You can take photos and project an image to the world of being a family man and accost women without remorse and with a sense of impunity. It happens every day in this country. It happened here on the steps of our nation's capital. It happens when individuals who hold the highest office in this land admit to hurting women and using this language against all of us. But once again, I thank my colleagues for joining us today. I will reserve the hour of my time, and I will yield to my colleague, Representative Jayapal of Washington. Thank you.
Okay, so Sarah, this was an incredibly powerful speech. I've seen few like it in my career in Washington. What did you think, and how did you feel when you first saw this speech?
I agree. This was one of the most transformative, kind of transfixing speeches by a member of Congress that I've ever heard, because it just it cut into this space and this truth that we need sunlight on. It's like a disinfectant. I was moved almost to tears watching her and feeling like reliving for myself, like every single time that I've had to stand up in a public or a private setting and say, what you just did was wrong, and this is why it's wrong. I know that there are just millions and millions of women and non-binary people, and also men, that are having to do this work of pushing against patriarchy, coming from a place of acute personal hurt. So it was just beautiful. I was so glad that it has gained enough, like, sort of public recognition that the speech, this moment, is going to have a lifetime, I think, in the future, as we as a community are reckoning with how men are operating in this space.
And for my part, I was pumping my fists because I was like, oh, she said it. She said all the things. Like, she just made all these points, this huge national platform. And of course, I immediately thought of you and your work. So I want to break this down, because she does a lot of things here that make this different than any other argument like this I've heard in the past at this sort of national stage kind of level. So the first thing that she does is she recaps the incident, and she names the deed in a way that Representative Yoho refused to do. And, one thing that was really striking was she said the words, right? So the F word, the B word, they're in the congressional record now. So I thought that was very powerful, because she took away his power to recast the narrative. So she got to just tell the truth, first off. She could have sugarcoated it, but she didn't. So can you unpack the intentionality there?
Well, I think how I experienced it was that intentionality to say the words is about reclaiming power, and about not letting the story be retold by a man who is unwilling to quote himself, subsequently. So she's putting a stake in the ground and saying, I will not be moved around what the fact, quote unquote, just the facts, ma'am. Like, this interaction did happen. And that feels like power to me. Just her bravery of actually saying those words, and not, using some sort of form of respectability politics to talk around what the words were, but to just explicitly say them.
And she also sets the scene, right? And I wonder if you could talk about why this is important. She talks about how there's a reporter there, so that this is in public in a hallway. She talks about how there's another member of Congress there who he's actually saying this to, and he talks about how physically intimidating he got. He got up in her face to repeat, stupid misinformation about what she had to say about crime in New York City. So why are all those elements important? Why is it important to set that scene?
Well, I think in the context of, like, what abusers do is abuse is not about, it's not about sex, and it's not about, like, necessarily the individual actions. It's about these transactions of power. And so having witnesses there, having another member of Congress there, having a member of the press there, all of those elements, witnessing his abuse towards her, all of that is a message that says, you can't do anything about this. You are powerless. And I can abuse you in broad daylight and with witnesses, and there will be no repercussions for me. That's how powerful I am. This is really, really common, I think, in dynamics with abuse, where the witnesses that are there are meant to also send a message about complicity and about powerlessness to the person who's being abused. The other thing is, we know AOC's, her narration of her past, right? She working in a bar, going to school, having this, like, pretty normal middle-class life, interacting with misogynists on a daily basis. And every woman knows what it means when a man sticks his chest out and steps towards her in this posture of threat. And so the physical threat as well, that how he stepped into her space, that's also a message which says, you're not safe. You're not safe because I have complete control over this situation. And, that's the kind of language like that is really some of the hardest parts about this, is that like a man like him can step into her space and physically transact in this way, and then trawl through all of the experiences that, women and femme-coded people in the world, femme-presenting people in the world are experiencing on a daily basis of like, I'm just another guy on the subway that's going to make you feel physically unsafe. So there's a cynical reason, to do all of those things at the same time.
And she uses a legal term here, which is impunity. And its literal definition is exemption from punishment or freedom from the injurious consequences of action. And as a legislator, for her to use that word, that really helpfully grounded her analysis, I think, and gets exactly to what you're saying about challenging this freedom that he thinks he has to just go be a misogynist to another member of Congress and God knows who else in his life as a legislator. She also, as she's setting this scene, she speaks about her own decision to rise and speak out instead of brushing it off. Mm-hmm. And that's a really critical decision point that then sets up her systemic analysis. Can you talk about that decision point a little bit more and why it's so important to speak up?
Well, I love the language that she used about how she's not losing sleep over his behavior. And she herself, she's got other things to do. And she has other worries, and she's not a container for his abuse. Like she has moved on, but his abuse is like a prism to see these dynamics more clearly. And so she is using him in this way as a tool to demonstrate how the system is effectively working. And I think that did one thing. It removes her from this petty landscape of personal conflict, which often is what, women that are in a position of quote unquote complaining about how behaviors or norms are operating inside of cultures or institutions with how power is transacted. Women are often just reframed as, petty and personally bickering and, mired in interpersonal conflict. And that is not what she's doing here. And her rhetorical use here of saying, it's really not about me. This ultimately is about how these interactions demonstrate these structural and systemic problems. That was really brilliant. And then, and so the part two, I suppose, is she was able to then really effectively pivot into using him as a tool and as a lens to demonstrate how these behaviors are normalized, and this is how power is transacted in the highest offices of decision making in government in our culture.
Yeah, what you said there just made me realize that when she invokes the work that she did as a bartender, which is, a very iconic part of her story, she's like mixed drinks again as a member of Congress as part of the fundraiser. That's part of her background coming up in New York too. And she pulls double duty there because I've dealt with guys like this before when I was a bartender. He's not special. This isn't about him. This isn't about our interpersonal conflict. He's in this category of people who do stuff like this to reinforce patriarchy and be misogynists. And it also brings in the class analysis, right? And then she goes from there, and she also talks about all the racist attacks that she and other members of the squad have faced, all the xenophobic attacks that they've faced, times they've been told to, quote, go back, unquote, to their countries of origin, even though they're from the United States now, right? So that leap to the systemic criticism and the intersectional lenses, that was amazing. There was already so much new going on here, but this was the moment for me where I was like, oh, wow, she's really going for it. She's really bringing in this full scope analysis. So I wonder if you could just talk about why all of that context is so important.
Yeah, I agree that listening to the composition of the argument that she provided, that was humanizing and normalizing both her experiences and his behavior, like setting him in the context of like, this is just another guy, another jerk that I have had to remove from a bar, right? It's hard for me to articulate the genius of what she did. And I feel like part of it is that I'm almost too close to it to really be effective in communication, because like this is shit that I am personally slogging through on like a day-to-day basis, and has really negative impacts on, many domains of my life, you might say, because of how normal these interactions are, and how this is how power is transacted at the highest level of the government. It's also how power is transacted inside of families and inside of marriages. So that, I think that that's part of the prism that needs to be kind of addressed here, is that these dynamics and interactions, they scale from the minute to the broad cultural context and framework. And I think when for someone as brilliant and articulate as AOC, she is able to move away from the paralysis that these interactions can often induce. Because when you are treated as, as an object, or when you are treated as, someone that you are sort of transacted around, but not directly interacted with, it's dehumanizing. And that dehumanization, it's sticky, it stays with you. It's like, it's hard to wash off, and it's hard to process, like, where are you going to find the places where you can actually be viewed without this dehumanizing lens. So there's a closeness that I feel to this that is both helpful and also unhelpful. The other thing about this is that because this is structural, and we're talking about intersections of discrimination and intersections of abuse, my experience as a white woman is more in line in many ways with the power that Yoho has to transact in the world, as coming from white supremacy. So I feel a proximity to the line of behavior that he is demonstrating because of the hierarchy across gender and race. And so I often look at these lenses, and I'm not necessarily identifying with AOC. I'm identifying with the sort of license, impunity that whiteness has to operate in the culture, and how I see, white colleagues and white peers operating in the culture. So I feel like I sit more with one foot in one place and one foot in the other in this dynamic, in terms of like my responsibility to steward and understand how the culture is operating. And I think that just is because of how whiteness is also working in these dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to your point, I think that one of the things that she's able to do here, she rises to give this speech as a matter of what they call personal privilege. And she's recognized, and she's able to deliver her speech. And the power here is the ability to require everyone to listen to what she has to say for 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And, that's power that's afforded her by her constituents, by all her hard work to get elected and be a member of Congress. And not everybody has that. Right. So she can actually force this issue in a really interesting way and bring this up that not everybody feels like they have the power to do at a staff meeting or whatever. And that's one of the reasons this is so powerful, because now, especially now that people have seen this, you can point back to it. And to your point of the impact this speech could have, you can just summarize so much of the time saying, it's what AOC said, right? It's that. We're talking about that thing. Remember that? And you don't have to sit down and relitigate this and fight for your own identity or fight for other people's identity in a conversation. It's really powerful stuff. I wanted to touch on a few other things she does before we wrap up. And one of them is that she as she's coming into the end of the speech, she brings it back to the personal, and she totally blows up I'm a father of a daughter thing, because she says she's someone's daughter too. And I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit, because she talks about how she was raised, and how she was not raised to stand idly by in the face of misogynistic abuse, and that was her experience as a daughter.
Well, her her emotion was rising as she spoke about her dad not being there to witness this, and that was a very powerful moment of I think actually some transparency around the personal pain of having to negotiate this kind of experience as a professional, even at the highest, like one of the highest levels of elected office that you can attain. That the sort of shame and wounding that does still come with these interactions was really palpable in that moment. So what I see her doing in that space is because, Yoho was so freely able to narrate himself as, the husband of wives and the father of daughters, and this characterization of him as like I'm the moral center of the universe, like, and I'm surrounded by women, and I know lots of women. She inverted that narrative and reminded those in attendance, and then those that were able to listen and view, that she actually has all of those same connections to parents, to family. She has the same moral currency that he is using and weaponizing against her. But instead of her weaponizing it against him, what she did is just to sit in her own humanity, and illustrate her own vulnerability, and illustrate the wounding and the pain that comes from having experienced these kinds of behaviors. But I would say, like, her characterization of, like, I had to show my parents that I am not willing to take abuse from men. Like, good job, parents. Like, because so many
Right.
of us are just taught, and I myself am taught, like, when abuse happens and when these dynamics happen, you need to shut up, because the only thing that will come from you speaking out is more abuse and more cost that you will pay. So not all of us are brought into places inside these narratives and told, like, you will actually, the right thing to do here is to stand up to abuse, regardless, come what may. And I wish that that was more normalized, so that we told people, we teach kids, like, ultimately doing the right thing is worth the cost that you will pay, because you're going to prevent other people down the line from paying the same cost. And abuse is never, it's never okay. We should not normalize it. So that the way that she walked through that was just so beautiful, and honestly really healing, because for AOC to say, I was raised to not accept abuse, it's like, yeah, I don't want to accept abuse either, for the domain that I sit in. And I don't want, my colleagues and friends and peers to normalize abuse. I don't want people abused. And so I think it's this big open door to say, like, hey, everyone, let's onboard into a framework where we don't normalize and accept abuse. And we are willing to pay the personal cost and currency for standing up to abuse in public.
And she actually thanks him at the end of this, and it really underscores the point and blows up his daughter's trip. Thank you for showing the world you can be a powerful man who can accost women even though you have daughters. Just nukes that argument from orbit. Like,
oh my God.
And it's such an attention grabbing moment too, because
like, shoot it into my veins.
And maybe she really she blows up the ability to make it a he said she said thing, because she thanks him. right? She really plays with people's expectations here and just subverts the heck out of them. It's so powerful. And she talks about one thing here. I hope you can unpack a little bit, because I don't think she had a ton of content on this in the speech itself, but she starts to define what a real apology looks like. And she talks about some powerful concepts here, which is that, you actually acknowledge the harm that's done. And we spent some time on that. But you also talk about repair. And you got a little bit to how she, give people hope by naming these things and seeing this. What does repair look like in a situation like this? And what does repair look like more broadly?
Well, the anatomy of an apology, right, is that you say, I'm sorry, not for my intention, but for my impact, how my actions, my words impacted and hurt you. And then you full stop and you wait and you pause and you sit with the discomfort of actually having done harm, and you don't rush in to fix and ameliorate. You sit in that brokenness with that vulnerability at an interpersonal level. I think the next step in the apology is, in the anatomy of an apology, is repair. So repair is not rushing in to say, I figured out what I did wrong and I'm all good. It's all done. Repair often in these dynamics is, I'm going to sit in this discomfort, and I'm not going to, unload my emotional baggage onto you, the person that I've hurt, for you to now feel bad for how hard that I'm working to make you feel better. I'm not going to engage in that dynamic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of remove myself from taking up space and from, performing this exonerative narrative. And I'm just going to go sit and think about this stuff. Maybe I'll talk to a close friend. Maybe I'll talk to a family member. Maybe I'll read some books. Maybe I'll listen to some other voices. I'm just going to sit and process and kind of come to terms and learn some new things. Not in a performative way, not in I want some cookies because I'm getting better, but actually showing up to do what is necessary to understand the dynamics that are in play and to take responsibility for the way that you transacted in harming others.
Particularly for people who uphold patriarchy, who are in leadership positions, the idea of just shutting up for a minute and thinking and processing it is so alien to powerful people who uphold these very damaging norms.
Totally. And I think that's why that making space, removing yourself, listening, doing the work privately, not doing it performatively, that actually is that is a revolutionary work that is about radical empathy and about radical listening. If you can engage in that process, then you can actually re-engage after a period of learning. You can re-engage with the intent, with the individual that you have hurt, to actually repair the wounds that did occur. And that can happen from, in many ways, from, engaging in projects or collaborations, in showing up and, power sharing with other individuals, with, telling the stories and upholding the stories of other people that are not your own, that don't continue to afford you moral centrality and this exonerative narrative. So I think there are real ways to engage in this. This is a feminist practice, ultimately, of engaging in this repair work at an individual level. But at a structural and a societal level, we have yet as a culture to do any of the deep apologies or repair work that need to come to address our collective history, right? We're on stolen land that was built on the bodies of people that were enslaved, and we have not addressed the wounding that happened and that is continuing to happen. And so, when I think of what will repair look like for our culture and our nation, repair is, reparation. repair is sovereignty of indigenous people to the lands that are their ancestral homelands. Like there's repair in these interpersonal dynamics, but we, I think, as a culture, need to step out and imagine what repair looks like at this really large level as a nation, as we repair the wounds that we have been complicit in normalizing and ignoring as a nation. And I say we often is used in a very problematic. So it's not necessarily we, but it is the powers of, the United States federal government and state governments. So
yeah, and this gets into really serious brass tacks policy issues, and I'll link to a guide that you and I collaborated on through Rowan Institute that gets to some of this, which I think is helpful for understanding that these aren't just concepts that are out here philosophically. This is policy. This is stuff that's affecting people's lives right now. So this was just such a rich conversation. Was there anything else you wanted to say about this speech or about this topic generally?
Well, I think anytime that we as a culture are focusing on what this form of feminist intersectional leadership looks like, this is also repair work. And it's restorative. Like I'm full of energy after this conversation, whereas other conversations that are continuing to focus on, the perpetrators and their bad behaviors, it's exhausting, right? But I think having new examples and new norms, new benchmarks to show us, like, we can actually move forward together culturally, interpersonally, into these new kinds of restorative and repairing frameworks to stop hurting people. It feels amazing.
And new leaders.
New leadership. Mm-hmm.
All right. Thanks so much, Sarah. That was such a rich conversation. I always learn so much whenever I talk to Dr. Myhre, and I always learn so much about how to communicate about these concepts. She's such an incredible leader in this field. I will include all this information on the Patreon, and thanks again for folks who are subscribing. I really appreciate that this work is resonating with people. This level of detail and analysis of political communication is useful for you, is entertaining for you, that you're getting something out of it. And please keep all the ideas for new guests, for new topics coming. Sarah, you can find her on Twitter at Sarah E. Myhre, SarahEmyhre. You can also check out her work at the Rowan Institute. She has a forthcoming book on storytelling, climate, and leadership from Columbia University Press, and is someone who, years and years ago, when I was doing science communication work at the Union of Concerned Scientists, I recognized as an emerging leader in this field, someone who was more than willing to speak truth to power inside and outside the scientific community, and someone whose work in this field I just deeply appreciate. So I'll link to some work we've also done there. I collaborated with her and some other folks associated with the Rowan Institute for a guide for constructively engaging in conversations around justice and intersectionality in climate policy. And also link to Kate Mann's book. Really incredible book. I'm not someone who goes out and picks up books of philosophy willy-nilly, but this one, it's just more than a book of philosophy. It's really an incredibly helpful framework for understanding power, for understanding patriarchy and misogyny, and how they're playing out in a lot of current debates and contexts. And I'll link to Kate Mann's Twitter too. She is always putting out a lot of great stuff. So I hope you learned a lot from that conversation. Hope that was a helpful framework for thinking about these speeches. And I'll just wrap up with two other thoughts here. One is that the misogyny, the racism, the xenophobia, the bigotry that's directed at members of Congress, like the members of the squad, it's a security threat. The reason people perpetuate acts of violence against powerful women of color, against LGBTQ leaders like Harvey Milk, against anyone they think shouldn't have power, they're trying to literally kill this person because they don't think that this person should have power. So the death threats against AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, other members of Congress, we all know on a basic level that they're dangerous and bad. But I've always thought that even if you disagree with these people and their politics in any way, really appreciating how dangerous these extremely personal, nasty attacks are and the culture they create and the death threats that these members of Congress get. It's a straight up security threat that is bad for Congress. It's bad for everyone who lives and works in DC, particularly folks who live and work around the Capitol. And it's a threat to democracy, right? Death threats against legislators, that's not a sign of a healthy democracy. So this stuff is worth pointing out. This stuff is worth fighting. And the last thing I'll say is that the bystander effect is real. And, Dr. Myhre is someone who's taught me to think about this and has really helped me think about my power, my privilege, and how I use it in some of these situations. And like we said, it's really easy to think about this as, AOC versus Representative Yoho, and it's not, right? She makes a great systemic critique because it's not just about these two people. It's also about Representative Roger Williams, who was also there when the confrontation happened, or Representative Yoho made the comment to. Why didn't he speak up? Why did Representative Yoho feel comfortable sharing that thought with Representative Williams? That's really worth sitting with and thinking about. And it might take another cishet white dude, Republican member of Congress, to get through to Representative Yoho, if at all. Maybe that'll never happen. But in our own lives, in our own personal lives, in our own professional lives, one of the most basic helpful things you can do as an individual is help make the systemic critique, help push toward these solutions that we talked about. And if you're coming from a position of privilege, if you're somebody who looks, talks, acts, presents like I do, you can use that. And speaking up in those situations is hard. It is uncomfortable. And I know it's not as hard for me as it is for the people who suffer from these forms of discrimination directly. So, it really always is worth speaking up. That's how change happens. And I feel pretty inspired by AOC too. And I feel pretty inspired by Dr. Myhre and her work. Thanks a lot.